little bit about the methodology. We don't need to pay a lot of attention here, but the methodology has some internal definitions of movement groups and lane groups. That's all internal to the method. An important step, and we'll be discussing a lot here, is the adjusted saturation flow rate. So this directly determines capacity, and there are a series of inputs that we use to adjust it to local conditions. We're going to see over the next slides. Proportion arriving during the green, that's related to those arrival types and progression. And at the end, we have steps similar to the other intersections. We compute capacity, check it against demand, compute contour delay as our service measure. We can aggregate into different bases, as we discussed before, determine level of service, and at the last step, we compute our queues, okay? And since we'll be talking a lot about saturation flow rate, that's probably the most important parameter we discuss in intersections, it's important to provide a proper introduction here. The definition provided by the HCM is an equivalent hourly rate at which queued vehicles can traverse an intersection. And that means whenever the signal turns green, that is the rate at which vehicles will be discharging at the stop bar, and that reflects capacity. How we measure that from the field, we don't count a rate directly, but we typically count the saturation headway, h, lowercase h, which is the difference of time between two vehicles that cross the stop bar. And we typically find something around 2 seconds per vehicle, which roughly translates into 1800, 1900, which is a common value for saturation flow rate. The HCM also provides some guidance how to compute those saturation flow rates from the field. If you want to do some calibration, what the manual tells us to do is we count headways, but we need to disregard the first 4 vehicles in the queue, because these are the ones that are experiencing the startup lost time. They are reacting, accelerating, or checking their phones. So research tells us that from the 5th vehicle and beyond in the queue, they start discharging in a steady rate, and that rate is the saturation flow rate if you want to do any kind of field measurements, okay? So how do we determine saturation flow rate in our HCM analysis? First of all, we need to start with a base saturation flow rate, or that's a starting value under ideal conditions. If we start a new intersection, the first input will be the base saturation flow rate that we can enter here. Most people use the recommended default value of 1900 passenger cars per hour per lane. HCM also recommends or suggests you can use 1750 for small locations with a population less than 250,000. But to be honest, I don't know a lot of people who do that. Most people just work 1900 by default. And on top of the base saturation flow rate, we're going to add a lot of adjustments factors to compute the final saturation flow rate based on my local geometry, and we'll be discussing that in just a moment. Before we get into those adjustments for saturation flow rate, we also have some new methods in the HCM 7th edition. We also can compute capacity impacts for the presence of CAVs here. The concept is similar to what we have discussed in roundabouts and freeways. We are assuming vehicles as level of automation 4 or higher. And depending on the degree of the market penetration rate, my base saturation flow rate can go all the way up to 2,900 passenger cars per hour per lane. So that's what research is suggesting us. Let's wait a few years or decades to see if that's accurate, okay? But if you need an estimate, at least HCM has something to provide us right now. Okay, let's go ahead then. We now that we know our base saturation flow rate, we need to compute our saturation flow, or S here. And we do that by applying a series of adjustment factors, as you can see here, to my input base saturation flow rate. No need to memorize this. We're going to discuss all of them, but the question is just to illustrate, how many inputs are required here, and they all are provided here in order to adjust saturation flow, okay?